Yes.
Thank you, sir. Apologies to have taken a little bit longer on the break. We needed to get a document available for these questions. Could we have DHSC 302351_004, please? This is an article in The Lancet from the 15th of January 1983, authored by Dr. Jones and others, headed Altered Immunology in Haemophilia. And in the second paragraph, we see this. There is reference, in the first paragraph to a study of T cell helper cells in haemophiliacs. And we see in paragraph 2, 11 patients showed an abnormality of T cell proportion, 8 having a reversal of OKT 4:8 ratio. Of these, 5 had depressed helper cells and 3 raised suppressor cells. There didn't appear to be any correlation with the presence or absence of factor 8 antibodies. Did you know of this article at the time of your May 1983 article?
I didn't know, this is the first time I've actually read it, precisely his article or letter. But what I did know was that the community was talking about him, as I've said before, knowing, which, and looking at it again now, to have written this, to look at T cell abnormality, which is, for those of us who don't know, is a very important part of the immune system. And if there were documented T cell abnormalities, this would suggest there was a problem. And I did know that he knew that. So beyond that, this is, to me, raises the question of why was he picking fights when he'd already identified there was a problem.
And when you say you had understood that he knew there was a problem, where had you obtained that information from?
Again, if you recall, this was a sort of a cloud of opinion. I can't identify one particular naysayer or one person who worked for him or with him. It would be haemophiliacs who were obviously asking those questions, who'd perhaps even seen this. It was the doctors' community that were already concerned. And Dr. Jones was, someone who knew, an intelligent person who's written this in The Lancet.
I'm not going to put this document up, but we have a letter from the managing editor that was sent to Dr. Jones on the 1st of July 1983, responding to his complaint. And one of the paragraphs I'm asked to read out is this: I must say that I'm concerned at your extremely strong criticism of Sue Douglas and would suggest that it's unwise to refer to anyone as showing appalling ineptitude. Any form of attack on individuals is really counterproductive to resolving this disagreement between us. Were you aware that that was the stance that your managing editor was taking?
Absolutely, and it had become very personal, and it would be something that was discussed with the editor, me and the managing editor, so that I was very aware of exactly what we were saying on my behalf.
Apologies, I didn't give the reference for that letter at PJON at 601_112, just for the transcript. Thank you.
So yes, I mean, George Woodhouse and I would have discussed it, but only in the presence with the editor. I mean, it would normally be with the editor that I was talking from management's point of view.
Was it your understanding that in making his complaint, whether Dr. Jones was acting independently, or did you understand others to be involved or encouraging his actions?
It was very much my view then. It's difficult to discern now with hindsight that he was almost having a crusade against me, and that it was very much shoot the messenger. And in the light of this particular letter that he'd already written, I would have known at that time that he knew there was a problem. Why was he picking on me and anybody else, the climate of fear, of actually saying anything further about we should do something?
If we could then turn to HSOC 001612, please. In the column furthest to the right, there are these two paragraphs. although the Mail on Sunday highlighted the problem 5 months ago, Health Minister Kenneth Clarke was still saying yesterday that there was little that I think should be that could be done. We will make every effort to find a risk-free source of blood. If we find such a country, we will certainly stop imports from America where AIDS is prevalent. I'm asked to ask you what your source of that information is, including the quote.
Ken Clarke Direct, who I would have been talking to and had seen it in person on a number of occasions.
Also in this article, we were discussing, if we just come out to the main article, we were discussing the issue of the conspiracy of silence. And I asked you whether you had spoken to the Haemophilia Society. And you indicated that you had.
Yes.
I'm invited to ask you who at the Society you spoke to.
I can't remember, but that was a dialogue, and there have been several people, not just one.
And your Cardiff source, that was not Arthur Bloom, appeared to be giving different information to you than what Bloom was giving to the Society. I'm asked to ask you whether you told the Society that your understanding was that Arthur Bloom had got it wrong.
I don't think it was ever my position to tell anyone anything beyond within articles or properly researched our readership. So the medical establishment, I wouldn't be telling any more than I would be voicing, I have been told these opinions, what do you say about it? So I would ask questions.
Can you tell us any more about what you said to the Society before this article was published?
This particular one?
In relation to the conspiracy of silence.
Again, it's taxing my memory, but as a code for journalists, I would always have questioned their response, probed deeper, tried to find points of difference, looked at weakness in argument and just said, why do you think that and what do you think of this? It would be very much questions rather than ever telling them anything other than things they'd already known.
That can come down, thank you. In relation to your earlier article, your first article, we discussed the Swiss Red Cross.
Yeah.
So it's not a question for this witness, but I am asked to flag that the inquiry, of course, has heard evidence from Diana Walford, in which she recalled and provided a copy of a memo from Dr. Gunson, who'd spoken to someone at the Swiss Red Cross who said there could be no question of supplying any plasma to the UK. So that's something I'm asked to simply flag and note. That reference is paragraph 86.35 of Diana Walford's witness statement. In our discussion, you mentioned that you were aware of the risks of the transmission of hepatitis through blood and blood products. Do you recall this being an issue of concern to you or others in the medical community?
Yes, anything that was transmitted that caused unnecessary disease would be an issue, and we would seek to flag that issue. The whole point of journalism is to ask questions and hopefully get solutions. So the fact that hepatitis and presumably, and there are other diseases, and possibly I'd cited other possibilities through blood transmission, and the point was always then, what is the risk versus the benefit of taking that treatment? Normally one would think in the medical community that there would be clinical trials and things like that. None of that ever happened, and neither was anyone really addressing the evidence of one against the other. That just wasn't happening. When one posed those questions, there was nobody actually picking up the baton and running with it to explore, well, what was the risk of transmission of even hepatitis?
You mentioned doctors' views, people you were talking to, that there was no option but to treat patients with factor VIII. Do you recall any discussion about whether a different approach could be taken in relation to mild or moderate haemophiliacs?
No, and I do think when I say there was no other treatment, that was something that I was obviously trying to explore as a journalist. What else are other countries doing? the whole heat treatment and filtering of blood, was that successful, wasn't it? This is such an early stage, we didn't know in the beginning whether that actually did filter out any potentially harmful bacteria, infection, or viruses. We just didn't know. And as we've heard at the very beginning, AIDS wasn't even actually confirmed as a virus until quite early on in all of this. So I think the point of this is exploration, encouraging the scientific community, which is perfectly capable of, to actually explore other options.
And was there...
Can I just check that you meant to say what you've just said? You're recorded, and I heard you say, as we've heard, at the very beginning, AIDS wasn't even actually confirmed as a virus until quite early on in all this. Did you mean quite early on or quite late on?
No, I meant at the time of the story that we've discussed as the first whistleblower story. The suspicion, but no confirmation in 1983, within the medical community, it was looking like that was the case. Later it was confirmed, and then everyone can say with hindsight, well, yes, we did know, but where were the definitive medical reports that AIDS was actually the virus? And I don't recall the exact date, but I'm not sure that there was an absolute coincidence of, yes, it's solid confirmation that this is how it's transmitted and this is a virus in 1983. I'm not sure.
You?
And within the discussions of treatment options, was there any discussion about cryoprecipitate? Do you recall?
There was, and again, it was so early on that when people were voicing alternatives like heat treatments, like all the other the changes in T-cell behaviour, none of this was definitive. These were all just, this is what's happening. The only evidence that we knew at that time in 83 is that haemophiliacs were getting AIDS. How were they getting AIDS?
To what extent did you research the safety of blood and blood products collected in the UK as opposed to the American imports?
From memory, I was told that we had no self-sufficiency. Possibly we did in the private sector, and that you could even...
Sorry, not in relation to self-sufficiency, but just in relation to the supply of plasma and blood. Did you investigate anything about the sources of the UK supply? Well,
we were getting the American supply. Is that what you mean? That we were getting only the American supply because, as I understood it, that was cost effective.
So you didn't undertake any investigation about sources of blood and plasma collected domestically?
Oh, I see what you mean. Sorry. Yes, I knew that. I mean, obviously the first question is, why can't we get the blood that we're collecting from donors in this country? And at that point, we were actually pre-programmed to get our Elstree laboratories up and running, but it was like 4 years from when I was reporting that we didn't have any central blood banks. And so what government policy was, and health policy was, that we would find a reliable and mass source cheaply, which we did from America.
The question is slightly different. I think we're almost there.
Sorry.
No, it's my fault for not framing this adequately. Did you uncover anything about where the UK blood and plasma was coming from in terms of whether it was the same as the US, places like prisons?
Oh, I see what you mean. Sorry, I completely... yes, because in this country, it's a volunteer thing. And in America, it was paid for and largely sourced from communities that needed that money, and particularly for prisoners and drug addicts and vagrants, and that there was a tradition of that blood being harvested, which we don't have in this country.
So I'm just going to turn my back and see if there's anything else anyone wants me to raise. So there's nothing further from those behind me. So do you have any questions you would like to raise?
Yes, I do. I'm interested, in particular, in where this all started for you in terms of time. Now, can I just put the question in context?
Sure.
What you've told us is you'd had experience of being around medical people because you worked for a medical journal. You had a friend, Lorraine, who was working
Still.
at the time
Yep.
in medical press when you became the medical correspondent of the Mail on Sunday. You said that before this article was ever published on the 1st of May, a number of things had to happen. First of all, you had to have an idea there might be a story out there. Mm-hmm. You took a little while researching it. You had another cocktail evening.
At least.
You took at least one. You took a bit more time researching it. Mm-hmm. You then went to politicians. You went to a contact whose name had been suggested to you. You went down to Bristol to Cardiff to see him.
Yep.
You spent some time talking to him, cultivating his trust, then slowly revealing that you were actually a journalist. All that must have taken some time.
It did.
So can you help, I know it's 40-odd years ago, but can you help trying to put when this began in your mind? Was it 82 or 83? Which side of Christmas, New Year was it?
It's probably 83, but again, I describe the process of any journalist, including working for a medical magazine. You would have stories in your head that you hadn't really quite investigated and really copper-bottomed was the expression, and you'd have them almost in your bottom drawer or in your memory bank to think, at the right moment, I'm going to concentrate on that story, but you need another trigger, like a paper or a doctor saying to you in this context, I'm really worried about this. Or, of course, the background to all of this particular story was that the growing monster of a story was AIDS. And it was almost subsidiary that anyone was worried about the context of another group of patients getting AIDS from a different route, because, of course, it hadn't been long in us discovering that AIDS was what we then nicknamed very cruelly as the gay plague. And there was all sorts of problems associated with anyone admitting they got AIDS because of that. So the background was always, maybe this is just a little story, maybe it doesn't really matter because the risk is very small, but I was aware of it, perhaps even as you've identified the other side of Christmas in 82, that this was a concern. By 83, I was thinking more people are telling me, so it wasn't just, as Sarah said, one source that was the whistleblower. It was other people just talking to you within that remit, because that's your specialism, and saying, well, what is this? Is it a virus or not? And if it is a virus and it's blood-borne, where else is it going? How is it being transmitted? So it's just the questions and the ambience, and the tipping point is always when several people then have published something in the Lancet or noticed something else or had that conversation. They don't want to be attributed as the tipping point. You're the messenger of all of that, and it's like an aggregate of all these little things that you're pulling together. Does that help?
So what you're describing, I think, is a swelling mood music.
Yes.
Is that an appropriate way of
It is
putting
totally that, and you look then in that swelling mood music for the key tipping point of then it's right now to draw the public attention to it. Otherwise, you could be buried in an avalanche of another story or something else when it wouldn't matter so much, and you couldn't actually be then the important agent of change.
Presumably you didn't only, when you did your research, look at who you might talk to or pick up on your human contacts, but you check, I would imagine, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, what else might have been written in the press about it.
Yes, and very little had been written. And the important thing there, again, is why was it a page one story with a sensationalist headline? Because there have been lots of little drip, drip, drip in the scientific press, in the medical press, in Lorraine's world. And why she and I had had that conversation was that the only way this is going to make a difference is if you talk to the public, ordinary people. They should know, and they are the ones at risk. And why are we not having that conversation? So that was then my job, and that's again at the point where you think now is the right time to actually make that very visible rather than a page 14 down the bottom little story about doctors being concerned about transmission of nasties through blood we're giving patients routinely.
You had a memory which you mentioned earlier in your evidence, that the Guardian might have published something. I think it may not have been the Guardian, but it might have been the Observer, because on the 14th of November, 1982,
Right.
for those who are listening, the reference is MDIA 5010. The Observer reported that haemophiliacs suffered from AIDS in the United States, and this is perhaps the interesting bit, that there was a, quote, major speculation that the AIDS virus, quote, is carried in the blood, unquote. Does that ring a bell at all?
Yes, and what I'm asking you is, where in the newspaper was that? Was it quite sort of...
That I
You
can't
don't
tell
know. But yes, I think you're right.
Because that was going to be my next question. The Observer came back to the same theme
Right.
in January. It was the 16th of January, and the reference for anyone who's interested is DHSC 303223_085, where the article stated that commercial blood product from the United States might pose a grave risk to haemophiliacs who inject it to encourage clotting, and because of probable risk of AIDS. So the Observer had come to it twice in those terms. Why do you think that there was then such a reaction to your article in a tabloid press, rather different readership perhaps than the Observer on a Sunday? Why do you think your article got the reaction it did when the earlier press doesn't seem to have done?
I think the answer is, if I'm correct, and obviously we can find out very easily, that it would have been somewhere in the mix of stories. So I would say, without conviction, if the Observer had put it on the front page, perhaps not with the headline that a tabloid newspaper had used, it might have got more attention. And then the tabloid press would have followed it and dared to follow it, even though it was never a great idea for a journalist just to follow somebody else's exclusive. The fact that a tabloid newspaper could do it, it's a little bit like, I'm giving an allegory here, it's when Kelvin Mackenzie, who was an infamous editor of The Sun, said, it's the Sun what won it with elections. And it's when you say it to millions of people that it's almost validated, because you're a man of the people, and you're talking to ordinary people who then, in a way, get up in arms and think, yes, I count, and I'm being listened to. Whereas in the Observer, and it's somewhere hidden down on page 14 down there, it's kind of like you haven't got the conviction to say this really matters. So I think the sensationalist accusation, which I was accused of at the time, I've been accused of many things working on tabloids throughout my career, and I really think it matters, because then you're talking to ordinary people rather than just talking to each other on the Observer or the Financial Times.
And the same would there were 1 or 2 articles in the Lancet, in the New Scientist, which had a popular readership, but not of the same sort as the tabloid.
A popular readership amongst doctors, and doctors would sort of be responsible and quietly thinking, this is really bad. But doctors aren't in a position then to say, right, we must go off and find whether or not Switzerland can do this, or we can get different supplies of blood. This is the blood we've got, this is the risk we take. And even if they were actually asking questions amongst each other, saying, shouldn't we be doing something? It's almost like this is the status quo, and no one even knows what the risk is, versus the risk of your haemophiliac patient dying if they don't take their factor VIII. So it's more about, I think, you're allowing a journalist the freedom to, especially a tabloid journalist, to say, oi, look at this is really important. Ordinary people, then to make the haemophiliacs say to the doctor who's giving them those treatments, yes, well, maybe there's some truth in this, and we're all concerned and we're looking for solutions, instead of thinking, well, it's a tabloid press and they got it wrong and she was irresponsible.
Your approach was to set out a story, set the facts, and leave it to others to draw their conclusions, because you weren't saying, you must do this,
No.
you must do that.
That was not my job, you're right.
Later on, though, you tell us the Mail, or the Mail on Sunday, I think, was founded a campaign.
Correct.
Now, a campaign is something rather different. It's not simply telling the story, it's actually seeking a solution or looking for an answer. What was the aim of the campaign which the Mail on Sunday then began to run?
It would be very definitely on behalf of patients, on behalf of readers, on behalf of the ordinary man. That was and remains, I think, what journalism is about, telling people things that they're not supposed to know, uncovering truths that otherwise they are excluded from. And that was very much the high ground, was the moral high ground of this is wrong, and we should be searching for different treatments. We should be looking at the facts. We should be working out what the risk is. And we weren't.
Was it seeking any particular response from government or the medical establishment?
Yes, and particularly the government and the medical establishment to say, yes, this is a problem, and we will investigate potential solutions. In the end, there might not have been one. But nobody was looking, as far as we could tell. And they certainly weren't telling us, as a newspaper, as the media, on behalf of the communication to patients and everybody, we're looking at it, we're taking this seriously.
So does it follow that the sense that inspired the Mail on Sunday's campaign was that action was needed and none was being taken,
Yes.
Even though it didn't know quite what the action should be?
100%. The action was going to be just ask questions, go and look, find out, see what alternatives there are. What are doctors supposed to do? What are they going to tell their patients?
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's all that I have to ask.
Ms. Douglas, is there anything else you would like to add?
I think it's very much, as you've asked me questions, have led me to say, with hindsight now, it's very odd that I sit here today with you defending the truth. Did I know that that was the case then? No, but isn't the job of a journalist to ask questions? And isn't the job of a government to look to investigate those possibilities and provide some solutions? And I think that chain, which we're so dependent on in democracy, was broken because there were vested interests, and I didn't know what those vested interests were, and I'm still confused why the establishment decided, no, there isn't really an answer. The horrible suspicion is that because we didn't really know enough facts, and we didn't at that point, that money was the thing that mattered, and that this was cheap, and it was a long-term deal, and anything else would be really expensive with an uncertain outcome. Just leave it. And I look back on that time and I think, have we learnt anything, even when we think about what happened with COVID? And what happened in particular with, and there's a little bit of personal story here because I was on the Oxford Medical Board for some time at Oxford University, and the pride of AstraZeneca quickly getting a vaccine, and then later we find out that there's a risk to young women in particular of clotting. And we've learnt a little bit that quite quickly that was in the public domain. So there's a risk, so it was removed. That's an improvement. It's still not great because probably people knew about that, and certainly anecdotally my daughter, who's in the high-risk group, was given an AstraZeneca vaccine after we knew that. But maybe we're getting better. But I just think there's a lack of transparency, and my job as a young reporter, and that remains the case, is to ask questions and make sure that they're addressed, and government is there to actually look into these things on behalf of the public.
It may be that the time for questions has finished because you've been invited to say your whatever you wanted to say at the end, but I can't let you leave without asking you this in respect of what you've just been saying. You've emphasised the importance of asking questions, at least getting answers to questions, I suppose. The importance of transparency. You've given the sense that things were not being acknowledged as they were when they should have been,
Yes.
and raising the question as to whether we have improved or not.
Yes.
How would you suggest, from your perspective in journalism, how would you see the best way of encouraging openness, transparency, and frankness? Candor, if you like.
That's such a good question. And of course, a journalist hopes that they are part of that process. Up to a point, with the internet, we've got now more possibility of openness and visibility and transparency. And yet, in a funny way, with the echo chambers, we haven't. I hope that that is the case and that that's accelerated. But then it's also for those in power to make those decisions, particularly when they're involving money, and that's our government, to actually understand that rather than just getting the wagons circling the problem and working out what to do on their own without any transparency, particularly in a medical context, the relationship between a patient and a doctor should be open and honest. And patients aren't babies. They don't need to be not told the facts by a doctor. They need to have that conversation and have the responsibility to make that decision for themselves. And medicine in particular, which looking back on it, my interest in it, there are no magic answers. There are very few. And it's a decision which is a risk-benefit analysis, which every patient for themselves is entitled to make with the support and backing of their doctor, who is the expert, but not God. And I think it's really important that we look at that in an era of so-called people power, whatever that actually means, that we do enfranchise that responsibility and allow people to make informed decisions with the support and help. And the government should be actually encouraging that, and in many contexts does. And a public inquiry, as we all sit here, can actually very quickly enable that, rather than leaving it for years and years and then just pushing it under the carpet.
Well, can I now come to thanking you? We've heard a lot about the terms of reference from a number of different perspectives. We haven't until now heard directly from a journalist and their perspective, and it's been refreshing to listen to your perspective, and particularly someone who was involved in a very personal way, a very uncomfortable way, right at the start of quite a lot of what was going on with AIDS, at any rate. And you've helped us to understand what that felt like from that perspective.
Well, it's almost, again, I thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk about it. And it's that famous saying which haunts me, don't shoot the messenger. And in so many ways, when people are uncomfortable with, if it's the establishment, the profession, the medical profession or government, when they're uncomfortable that there are no solutions, then surely the drive should be to find solutions in an open society, not just close ranks and think, well, we'll cover that up and hope it goes away. And what happened, I mean, the whole responsibility that this inquiry has already, under your directorship, allowed very speedy compensation. There's no compensation for a lost life in terms of cash. The thing that a journalist would hope for, and I'm sure the people who have been affected, an open society is about changing this and learning from the mistakes of the past and being open about that process and understanding how we could do better next time, and the next time, post-COVID, the next thing that we face, rather than thinking, well, we're not sure about the solutions yet, and we'll just actually, as I said, corral everything, and when we've worked out what to do, we'll let you know. We're all involved.
Thank you very much.
So this afternoon, the rest of the morning and this afternoon, it's after 12:30, but we will be having a presentation on the destruction and retention of medical records. I wonder if we can just take a short break before we start that presentation.
Well, yes, of course. We need to draw breath, I think. Shall we come back then at 22 to 1?
Thank you.
And we'll have 20 minutes of your presentation, or thereabouts, before our usual lunch break.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.